Thanks, Stas. Good evening, everyone. Okay, so my first thing was going to be, do you all know where the book is? But we've already done that in the reading, so that's good. I was going to help you by telling you it's nestled in between Nahum and Zephaniah. Hopefully that's helped. Would have helped you lots. If you're anything like me, with the 12 books that we call the minor prophets, that the Jews call just the 12, and it's all one sort of book for them. If you're like me, like you're okay at the beginning, you know, it starts with Hosea and Joel and then Amos, and then it maybe gets a bit fuzzy, and you know at the end it's going to end up with Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, but the bit in between, sometimes the memory forgets a little bit what it learnt when it was younger. So anyway, we're all there in Habakkuk. Now, I called this talk the Pronouncement of Habakkuk for two reasons. The first one's a bit frivolous, really, and it's because this prophet's name has got 3 syllables, and basically there's 3 different ways we could pronounce the name. And I've heard at least 2 of them amongst Christadelphians, and it appears that neither of them are the way that the Jews would pronounce it. So that's interesting. So I think maybe it's just a part of the country I'm from, I'm not sure, but I think I grew up with Habakkuk, like the emphasis on the first syllable. I think I learned from some brothers when I moved to the West Midlands, Habakkuk on the second syllable. And the Jews apparently would say none of that, and they'd say something like Habakkuk with a v instead of a b, Habakkuk, and the emphasis on the last syllable. So that's frivolous. But the reason it's the pronouncement of Habakkuk is because you've got the burden, if you're reading the King James Version, right there in the very first verse. The ESV says oracle, the oracle that the prophet Habakkuk the prophet saw. And that's an interesting word, just to start with, this idea of a burden or an oracle, because it's a word that appears to have sort of a double meaning, or at least there's two different sort of separate words with the same spelling, or it's sort of a double meaning. So the two ideas are, yeah, a weight, a burden, something heavy, or a message, a pronouncement. And you might remember that there's actually quite a few times this word in the King James Version comes out as burden in other places, like in Malachi, in Isaiah. There's a few places where there is a burden given, and modern versions might say something more like message, oracle, or pronouncement. So it's got those two perhaps ideas mixed in together, and looking a bit in Jeremiah, which we won't do tonight, I think we might be able to see that the two ideas are complementary, or there's a double play on the word. So that the message is something that's heavy, is something that is potentially difficult or to be heard. It's a hard message, or it's something hard to bear, something that will weigh upon us when we hear it, potentially. Interestingly, what we have in this book, these 3 chapters, is something I think it's useful just for us this evening to think about as a whole, as what's going on in the whole of this book for us, because it feels to me there very much is a clear story, narrative, or progression that go right through the 3 chapters, and we have to sort of read them together, or to consider them together to get the full message of what we're being told here, which perhaps is a little bit different from when we come to some of the longer prophets, and even some of the shorter ones, where we can feel we can like look at a section in isolation, and it's got a specific point, and then it moves on maybe to something else further on in the book. I haven't got an answer for this, but I thought it was just interesting to see that it says it's the oracle that Habakkuk, I think that's the way I'm going to pronounce it, I'm not sure, we'll see. Habakkuk the prophet, it's the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. And I think that led me in my younger days to have an assumption that this word oracle, burden, had to do with seeing. It doesn't actually, as I've already said, it's weight and pronouncement message. But it's interesting, isn't it? Habakkuk, the prophet, sees what we're about to read or scan over together this evening. Because it doesn't read like something that he saw. It actually reads, to me at least, something that he experienced and he lived through, and we're getting a record of a conversation that he has with the Almighty, that he initiates at verse 2 of chapter 1. And we get an answer, another question, another answer, and then the chapter 3 that we read as a prayer of Habakkuk in response to what's gone on in chapters 1 and 2. So something he's lived through perhaps more than seen. So why does it say seen? And I'm not sure, but the other potential, I suppose, is that he envisions this conversation, he's rehearsing this conversation in his private, in his head almost, and he feels that God is in the conversation. I'm not sure. That's not to say, I'm not saying that God isn't really in the message at all and he's just making it up. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just sort of trying to work out what he means by what the prophet Habakkuk saw here. All right, let's leave that to one side then and just think about the history and when we're going to fit this prophecy into the history of Israel. Because there's not a lot in the book itself that sort of names cities and people for us in terms of what's going on at the time of this oracle. But there are one or two clues, I think. So, for example, we get reference to the Chaldeans in chapter 1, verse 6. We'll come back to what God's going to do with the Chaldeans a bit more in detail in a bit. But notice, I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, God says. And he says it in the context of, I'm going to do a work in your days, verse 5, that you would not believe if told, right? So that says to me that Habakkuk is going to be shocked, maybe surprised, if you hadn't already been told this by God, that the Chaldean nation suddenly would become such a prominent nation and a nation that God potentially brings into conflict and contact with his own people. So that, and also that suggests to me, I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe, that this isn't a prophecy for 100 years in the future, that the Chaldeans are going to be raised up surprisingly and quite quickly, quite soon, in terms of whenever Habakkuk is having this conversation with God. There we go, I changed my pronouncement already. So where does that put us? The other thing that potentially we could notice that might help is we've got reference to the temple at the end of chapter 2, verse 20, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all earth keep silence before him. Now that may be a sort of a heavenly temple, not the temple in Jerusalem, and there's sort of we could have gone on, but it feels to me like that's not the case, particularly with the rest of the message and the Chaldeans yet to be raised. So we're looking definitely potentially at the time of temple worship still in Jerusalem. And added to that, we've got the whole thing in chapter 3, where we've got a prayer and it's addressed at the end to the choir master with strings instruments, which suggests, again, that there's an intention that chapter 3 ought to be used for public worship and teaching in the temple area. So what that also suggests the temple's in use and that we're not in a time of total abandonment of the worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem. All right, so where does all that put us? Well, when did the Chaldeans, let's switch to calling them the Babylonians, because that's what we tend to call them more often. The Babylonians, and we famously know about Nebuchadnezzar because he's there through our scriptures. When did they burst onto the scene? And the answer is pretty definitively with Nebuchadnezzar's dad, a chap called Nebuchadnezzar, I think is how you say it, and he burst onto the scene in the late 7th century BC. The date that I found was 626 BC is when he's crowned king in Babylon. And this is a surprising thing, because the Assyrians have been the dominant power in that Mesopotamia area for a number of decades, even centuries. And all of a sudden, the Assyrian power is swiftly dried up by the Babylonians, the Chaldeans. So we probably don't need to go into the detail of the history of those two much more, the Assyrians versus Babylonians, but just to be aware, the Babylonians spring up suddenly 626 BC. And if you remember your Bible dates, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar comes in something like 586 BC. Okay, so we've got a period there of, what's that? Something like 40 years from when the Babylonians spring onto the scene to when the Babylonians actually come and sack the city of Jerusalem and burn the temple. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because 40 years is something similar to the sort of time scale of the Olivet prophecy. If we think when Jesus gave that prophecy on the Mount of Olives to when the destruction of Jerusalem comes in 70 AD. So all of that labour to say is sometime before 626 BC, sometime 40 years before the Babylonians finally came and destroyed the temple, this conversation, this vision appears to have been given to Habakkuk, and not too long before that, I'd suggest as well, which suggests as well, if we want to go backwards in time from them, I'd say maybe we could put at the other end of our time frame the time when Manasseh has been taken captive by the Assyrians to Babylon, because they have control of Babylon at that point, and is subsequently released, that we read about in 2 Chronicles chapter 33. I'm not sure when that was exactly, but I think we can say roughly we're talking about 650, 640, something like that, as when this prophecy is given. Okay, enough on that. What's the structure of the book? So let's just put up a slide if I can for you. I hope this works. So it's a fairly simple structure. Straight introduction in verse 1, chapter 1. A question, Habakkuk's questioning. So there's questioning going on from the prophet in this book. And God is gracious and merciful to respond to Habakkuk's questioning. And we end with a meditation or a resolution, a prayer on the basis of what he's heard in the questioning and the answers from Habakkuk, sort of set himself how to approach the future in light of what he's heard from God. Okay. That's one that's hit. So let's just work our way through it. The first set of questions, chapter 1, verse 2. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear, or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, justice never goes forth. The wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Okay, so we're sort of thrown straight in to almost like a torrent of questions, and almost sort of accusations towards God. Why is this happening to me? I don't know if you noticed, but there's quite a lot of emphasis on the prophet himself here and what he personally is experiencing. How long shall I cry to you for help? Why do you make me see iniquity? Why is destruction and violence before me? Okay. And I suggest, so then that's his immediate surroundings, the life he's experiencing in, I could say, Judah, in the time of maybe late reign of Manasseh, maybe reign of Ammon, maybe even the reign of Josiah, because we know the people did not necessarily follow the king's personal seeking of God. But wherever in that sort of rough time scale, the conditions and the spiritual health of the nation, as far as Habakkuk is concerned, it's sick and it's not intelligible from his perspective as to why the Lord is allowing the state of affairs that operate in his day. And that maybe is something that we can very quickly sort of find a sort of resonance with for ourselves. Why does God appear to be inactive? Why does he appear to not really respond swiftly to violence and perversion and the wicked prospering and the righteous not so being surrounded by the wicked? There are real problems for Habakkuk in his day. I suggest to you that what Habakkuk says there is heartfelt. It's not like he's going through something as an exercise just to teach others at the end of it and sort of, oh, here's how you could be thinking, or and by the way, here's the answer by the time we get to the end of it. To me, it feels like it's something for him personally that's difficult, that he feels there is injustice currently with God, and he's willing to question God as to why that is. But the interesting thing throughout the book is, whilst there is this confrontation to an extent with God from the prophet doesn't seem to me to go over a line where it's a line where he's abandoning his trust in God. He has questions, he doesn't understand everything, but he knows that and he wants answers. But by the time we get to the end, we see that he's still within the bounds of submitting himself and resolving to submit himself to God's plans and purpose. And so in that way, Habakkuk maybe gives us a great example of how we're to think of ourselves in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Right, so what's God's first answer then? So chapter 1, verse 5, we've already alluded to it. It's I'm going to do something amazing. You wouldn't believe it if you were told. I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. All right, so God is gracious enough to give an answer to the challenge Habakkuk's given. And the answer is to the evil and perversion of the law that's seen in God's people, God's going to raise up foreigners, Gentiles, to solve the problem of evil in God's people. A bitter nation, a nation that are greedy. Verse 7, they're dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Suggests very much like a world of today where it's from within themselves that they seek to gain their own strength and direction in life rather than from a valid higher source of authority from God himself. And as we go through the description, we find they are, verse 11, they are guilty men whose own might is their God, sort of emphasizing that point of reliance on their own strength. And not only that, sort of making it into their their God, their idol. So I guess it's not too hard to see, if we put ourselves in Habakkuk's position, he's raised his questions about why is God inactive and allowing evil to prosper in Judah? And the answer God gives him in like really quite sort of a descriptive way, almost to prompt the questions. Almost God's giving goes out of his way to say, I'm going to raise up an ungodly nation. I'm going to deal with ungodliness in Judah, with ungodliness, with Gentiles doing the work of judgment and taking captive my people. So Habakkuk responds with further questions, given that provocative answer. Are you not from everlasting, verse 12, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. It's a statement of faith. I think he's saying the nation as a whole will not totally perish, despite the bleak picture God's given. Maybe we should put it with a question mark. We surely we shall not all die, shall we? The Lord who has ordained them as judgment, you have ordained them as judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. So he's saying, okay, I think what you're saying to me, God, is you're not going to destroy us completely with the Chaldeans, but you're going to use them for judgment and for reproof. We won't look at it now, but it seemed to me what Habakkuk's remembering here is something like Deuteronomy chapter 32, where we have in Deuteronomy 32 a prophecy of the future rebellion of the nation, and a very similar sort of program is set forward there, and and also a promise that God will eventually have compassion on his people and work through his correction of them in similar way to as being described here to Habakkuk. But then the questions come again. Who are you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong? Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? Okay, so that suggests Habakkuk is still confused. He's saying, I don't understand your first answer entirely, because what you seem to be saying, God, is something that seems instinctively unfair. You're going to deal with the problem I originally gave to you, but you're going to deal with it by even more evil, more unrighteous people beating up on the people I'm worried about in the first place. How can you be prepared, seems to be actually, how can you be prepared to use and condone, apparently, the wickedness of the Chaldeans against your own people? Those seem to me the sorts of questions that are going through Habakkuk's mind and what he's expressing here. And we get the picture as Habakkuk continues of the way that the Chaldeans are acting, again, as idolatrous, merciless idolaters, in the way that they act as like fishermen amongst the nations who they seek to conquer. Verse 17, is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Have you told me the whole story yet in your first answer, God? Because it doesn't feel like that should be the end, that you just deal with the destruction or the evil of my people with an eternal sort of punishment from an even more evil, godless nation. I will take my stand, and the chapter division there is really not helpful at all. I will take my stand upon my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me, what God will say to me, and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So again, descriptive language of the way that Habakkuk knows he's talking to God. It's a complaint he's pouring out. And he's also saying, I feel like I need further response from God. So we get in the rest of chapter 2 the second response of God, and we get as far as Habakkuk is concerned, the whole of the answer of God. Now we've had the first half of it, and now we're going to get the remainder. And by the time we get to the end of chapter 2 with this whole answer of God, Habakkuk is in a place with that answer to have had his perspective changed from complaining to a certain extent, and confusion and wanting to know answers and feeling like there's potential injustice floating around the whole scenario, to being willing to surrender himself, submit himself to the way God has said God will work. So again, it's a great case for us to read through and work through ourselves if we're feeling in a similar way, in any sort of sense to how Habakkuk feels in our time, and our feeling of potential. Where is God in the world? What is he doing? Why is the kingdom not yet come? Why is evil prospering? How long can these things go on? Questions like that we might have. So the answer, second answer, the Lord answered me, verse 2. Write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Okay, so I don't know what you think about that. That feels to me like it's almost saying you need to wait, but it's coming in its own time and it's not going to be delayed. And it's not necessarily saying that the whole end result is going to come next week, but it's going to come at a time God already knows about, and it's in God's control. Still, the vision waits its appointed time. It had me in mind of Acts chapter 17, that God has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness through that man who he has appointed. Fixing and appointing was the thing that took me back to this appointed time. God's always had the times in his control. And Habakkuk and we, through taking the message here and applying it to ourselves, have the exhortation to wait. That's all he's being required to do in the difficult circumstances he finds himself in, the distress, the anguish that he's in, what's going on around him, and now knowing how it's going to be dealt with. It's not the way maybe he would have chosen personally. The thing he's being asked to do is to wait for it to come at its appointed time. Now, verse 4 seems to me to be like the pivot, the turning of this chapter. And it seems to me like the second half of verse 4 is connected with what's gone before about waiting, and how the righteous, the faithful, ought to be reacting in the light of what God's already said. And the first half of verse 4 is then going to give us an introduction to what continues in the second half about what God already knows about the Chaldeans and what's going to happen to them. And so we've got this sort of like inversion where I'm almost imagining like a sort of like a link, a chain thing, where we get a premonition in the start of verse 4 into what's coming, and we get a sort of link back at the end of verse 4 into what's gone before. And so we just need to finish off this exhortation. But the righteous in contrast to the one like the Chaldeans, who's unlike the evil in Judah, whose soul is puffed up, in contrast to somebody who is proud, self-appointed, self-elevated, in contrast to that, the righteous shall live by his faith. And we'll see as we work through some reference back as to how, what the vision is to help us to live by our faith. Okay, so let me just share with you my screen again. Right. Okay, so this is just to pick out the structure of the rest of chapter 2. And what we have in the rest of chapter 2 then, from this point on, verse 5 onwards, and going into verse 6, is a series of woes. You can maybe see them at the start of verses. Verse 6, actually, it's halfway through. Woe to him who heaps up. Verse 9, woe to him who gets evil gain. Verse 12, woe to him who builds a town by blood. Verse 15, woe to him who makes his neighbours drink. And then the last woe that probably starts actually in verse 18, but the woe actually comes in verse 19 in the middle of that section. Woe to him who says to a wooden idol, to a thing, awake. Okay, so all of the issues that come through the Chaldeans and the way they are in their character, in their intentions and the evil intentions that they are going to come with to conquer and to steal and to plunder, and to do it all trusting in their idols. God knew all about that. He knows about that before he uses them, and God is going to deal with them in the appropriate way. The woes are pronounced upon them, and it almost reads like in these woes a sort of history of what the Babylonian conquests are all about as far as Babylonians are concerned. You know, first there's this sin of envy and greed that comes out about the way they're going to take what's not theirs. Sort of it uses the terms about borrowing it, but also plundering many nations. Secondly, then this sort of selfish ambition to rule over others, and to set the nest on high, to be safe from harm, and to conquer as a way of dealing with the threat of being conquered themselves, to making themselves secure in their own strength. The ruthlessness and the violence comes out of their conquering comes out in verse 12, that they're building a town through blood, founding cities on iniquity. Behold, it's not from the Lord of hosts that the people labor merely for fire, that the nations weary themselves for nothing. And the answer is yes, it is from the Lord of hosts that these people are on this futile evil expedition. Woe to them when they enjoy the fruits of their conquests through debauchery and oppression. They drink themselves, they show their uncircumcision, and as a result the cup of the Lord's right hand will come round to you. Utter shame will come upon your glory. God will deal with the evil of the Chaldeans in their own turn. And finally, putting their success down to their idols again will be dealt with. But in the midst of all of that, and the negative, and the reassurance that God does know how to deal with evil, and that the Babylonians are only being used initially against God's people to reprove and to punish, to seek a better outcome for his people. God will deal ultimately with evil. And it's interesting, isn't it, perhaps, that the questions that Habakkuk answered the second time round were a more expansive set of questions. I mentioned the first time the questions were quite personal, immediate to his circumstances. The second set of questions seem to go to the more general point of, well, why is there evil at all? Why is God allowing evil at all? If his answer is to use the Babylonians, well, that just takes the question wider, doesn't it, in Habakkuk's mind? And God now deals with the answer to say, wait for my appointed time, wait by faith. Verse 14, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Verse 20, now these are the positive for the righteous that are waiting messages. But the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silent before him. Now you may know that That little phrase, the righteous shall live by his faith, is picked up and quoted 3 times for us in the New Testament. And let me just go back to sharing just so you can see that. Is that going to do it? Share that. Yeah, there we go. The slides are slightly out of order. Yeah, there's the 3 times: Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. And you can see that, leaving aside the Romans and Galatians ones for tonight, let's just focus on the Hebrews one, the last one. Look at the context in which it's spoken to the Jewish Christians and the circumstance they find themselves in the first century: oppression and the temptation to be drawn back into Jewish society. You have need of endurance. Isn't that similar to what Habakkuk's been told about waiting? And when you've done the will of God, you receive what is promised. For yet a little while, the coming one will come and will not delay. My righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, and my soul has no pleasure in him, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Now that's interesting in Hebrews, I think, because really that section at the end of Hebrews 10, if we take out Hebrews 11 as a massive sort of case study of examples of a crowd that are encouraging us as we seek to endure and live by our faith, endurance is the theme from the end of chapter 10 in Hebrews through into the beginning of chapter 12. And I'm taking Hebrews 11 as a massive detour that, nevertheless, once we've gone through it, we need to get back to our theme of endurance. The righteous shall live, my righteous one shall live by faith. Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely. Let us run with endurance. Running, interesting, wasn't it? That was the thing that happens in Habakkuk, running, the one who reads it. Run with endurance the race set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. So we can connect the way that God responds to Habakkuk with the way that the Lord Jesus Christ himself experienced God's purpose working through him, and that the answer wasn't an easy one to the question, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And Habakkuk, it seems to me, is being shown the perspective that allows him to have a similar attitude, not to the point of shedding his blood, but in a similar sort of way, to submit himself to God's will and to understand that God has a greater way of working. It comes again through these 2 shafts of light that come through chapter 2. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Okay, we are to wait and live by faith with that vision in mind, that ultimate reality, that purpose of God, to believe that that's where God is taking us to through whatever difficult circumstances we find and whatever evil prospers in the meantime. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And that's a theme, as we know, that is a thread through our scriptures. So that's one perspective that's being given to the questioning Habakkuk, to remember the end point, what God is seeking to do in all of this. And it's greater, more glorious than anything that's happening in the moment. And secondly, at verse 20, it's the righteous live by their faith in God's continuing current sovereignty over his creation. That God is in control. God knows what he is doing. God is not just being silent. God is not just disinterested, as Habakkuk may have been initially alleging. Why do you look at wrong? But that God is in control, and even in those that he raises up, the basest of men, he is still working. And so there's the perspective that Habakkuk has been given. And as a result, as a faithful prophet, as one who seeks to know God and to serve him, Habakkuk, given that full answer, is content to submit himself to God. And that's what we read, wasn't it, in chapter 3. There's a hint of sort of Job's outcome, the way that Job submits to God by the end of the book of Job. Something similar seems to have been going on here for Habakkuk as well as Job. His perspective has been changed because in chapter 3 he is seeing by faith. And he says, chapter 3 verse 16, I hear and my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound, rottenness enters into my bones, my legs tremble beneath me. Right, so he's heard what God said, and it's not necessarily been pleasant. It's been this burden, as it started in verse 1 of chapter 1. It remains a burden. Yet I will quietly wait, responding to what God has said about waiting for it. I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. I think I'm reading the ESV tonight. I should have said that at the beginning, but that verse 16 there came out much clearer in the ESV as to the way that it felt a little bit underplayed in the King James version. I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. I will wait. In other words, I will wait, trusting that God is working through the whole situation, and though it's going to be a burden, and though it's going to bring terrible things for our people, eventually God will bring trouble upon those who are going to invade us. Though the fig tree shall not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Well, that's quite poetic, I guess we initially think. We've got hymns about it. But that's actually, I think, Habakkuk are imagining the practical implications of what is to come upon his people. Famine, a literal lack of food as a result of the Chaldeans sweeping over the land without pity. And knowing that's coming, he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. So that's a wonderful perspective that Habakkuk has got to, and he's done it in the earlier bits of the song the prayer that he's giving here, asking God to continue or to revive his works. Verse 2, I've heard the report of you, your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of years, revive it. In the midst of years, make it known. So he's submitting to the will of God and saying, you've said these things, these terrible things are coming. Okay, I trust you to know what you're doing, and I trust you, and I ask you to bring your will to be done. In other words, in wrath, remember mercy. Okay, and maybe that's a key thing for us to extract again in the way that we approach your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. When we pray for things to come upon this world, our prayer to God also is, we know his wrath's coming, we know judgment of God is there on the ungodly, but he might remember mercy in what's coming. And the way Habakkuk prays here is clearly pleasing to God. He remembers God in the past. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. He's remembering Israel coming out of Egypt. He remembers verse 7, God working miraculously in days of people like Gideon. He remembers God acting miraculously in the days of people like Joshua, verse 11, the sun and moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows. They sped at the flash of your glittering spear. So God remembers, Habakkuk remembers God has worked historically in powerful, miraculous ways. And he's going to do it again. And I might not like the answer. I might not like the way that it's going to work out this time. But I trust in God and I ask him to do it accordance to his will, and in wrath to remember mercy. So just to conclude, let's just have a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, because I think we can, as I've said already, see a resonance with Habakkuk's experience with maybe how we might feel about the way God works. But and that comes out for us in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, I think, because verse 6 talks about God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Now, there's an obvious link there, and an end point, a full extension of that thread that was running through, that's there in Habakkuk, about the knowledge of the glory of God filling the world as the waters cover the sea. And we've had, in contrast to Habakkuk, we have had that perspective and that vision made more clear and more fully revealed to us than Habakkuk ever did. And so whilst he was encouraged to live by faith and be righteous that way, we've got all the more reason for it, because God has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of his glory in the face of Jesus Christ. God has sent Christ for our salvation, for the destruction of evil, and to deliver us from sin. God has raised him from the dead and given him all power. So just as it's talked about the Lord in his holy temple, we've got the reassurance of the Lord Jesus Christ himself seated at the right hand of the Heavenly Father. And our situation, therefore, is never as bleak as it appeared to Habakkuk in his own day. We have seen that God has worked powerfully in the past in this additional way that Habakkuk was coming after Habakkuk, that God gave his only begotten Son because he loved the world and for our sins. And so we can be confident that if we, like Habakkuk, wait for the appointed time, for the time to come when God will set up his kingdom to fill the earth with his glory, in God's mercy, we have the hope that we too, maybe like Habakkuk, will be one of those who have been considered righteous as a people living by faith.